Hi guys, welcome back. Today's story and nail design is Hansel and Gretel. I was really surprised when I read this story because there were some parts in it that I didn't remember at all, and some parts that I was a little bit shocked about, and how we grew up with these stories. I think that's so amazing that we turned out all right, even after growing up on these stories. I hope you enjoy today's story and nail design, and let me know what you think about it in the comments below. Thank you so much, and please subscribe. And now, on to the real story of Hansel and Gretel. Once upon a time, a poor woodcutter lived on the edge of a forest with his wife and 2 children. The boy was called Hansel, and the girl Gretel. They never had enough to eat, and as time went by, the whole country ran short of food, and the family began to starve. At last, all they had to eat were a few shriveled apples. There was not even so much as a crumb of bread left in the house. That night, when the woodcutter went to bed, he said to his wife, who was the children's stepmother, "What is to become of us all? How can we live without food?" "We can't," she said. "Tomorrow morning we must take the children into the farthest part of the forest and leave them there while we go and collect wood to sell. They will never be able to find their way home again, and we shall only have ourselves to find food for." "No, wife," protested the woodcutter. "I can't leave my own children in the forest to be eaten by the wild beasts." "If you don't, all 4 of us will die of hunger, and you may just as well go and start making our coffins now." And being a mean and nagging woman, she went on arguing until at last he reluctantly agreed to her heartless plan. Now Hansel and Gretel had not been able to go to sleep because they were still so hungry, and they overheard what their stepmother had said. Gretel was very frightened and began to cry. "We're going to die, Hansel," she wept. "Don't cry, Gretel. I'll find a way to help us," Hansel reassured her. He waited until his father and stepmother had gone to sleep, and then he got out of bed, put on his clothes, opened the door, and slipped out of the house. The moon was shining bright, and the white pebbles that lay in front of the house glittered like pieces of silver. Hansel bent down and filled his coat and trouser pockets with them. Then he went back to Gretel, who was still awake. "Don't worry, little sister," he said, hugging her tight. "I'll see to it that we don't get lost in the forest." And they went to sleep with their arms around each other. At dawn, the stepmother came in and shook them awake. "Get up, you lazy bones! We are all going into the forest to fetch wood." She gave each of them 2 apples. "That's for your lunch," she said sourly. "That's all you get today." Gretel carried the apples in her apron, for Hansel had his pockets full of pebbles. After they had walked a little while, Hansel began to lag behind and kept looking back at the house. His father noticed this. "Why are you always looking behind you?" he asked Hansel. "You'll stumble and fall if you don't take more care." "I'm just looking at my white kitten, father," said Hansel quickly. "It's sitting on the roof and waving goodbye to me like it always does." "You fool!" scolded his stepmother. "That isn't your kitten. That's the sun shining on the chimney." But in fact, Hansel was laying a trail of pebbles on the path behind them. When they had reached the middle of the forest, the father said, "We shall light a big fire here. You can keep it alight with the dry sticks on the ground." And when they had collected a large heap of these, and the flames began to take a good hold, he told them, "Now lie down by the fire, children, and rest. Your mother and I are going further into the forest to cut more wood. When we have finished, we shall come back and fetch you." So Hansel and Gretel sat down near the fire and waited. They stoked it and waited. At lunchtime they ate their apples. They could hear the sound of an axe in the distance and thought it was their father felling trees, but it was not an axe that they heard. It was a branch the wind was blowing against a tree. They talked a little at first to cheer each other up, but after they had waited a very long time, their eyelids grew heavier and heavier. Finally, huddled together, side by side, they both fell fast asleep. When they woke up, it was completely dark. and the fire had gone out completely. "We shall never find our way out of this wood again," cried Gretel, beginning to weep. "Wait," said Hansel. "The moon will be up soon, and then we shall be able to see again." Once the moon had risen, he took his sister by the hand and followed the track of the pebbles, which shone like silver coins in the moonlight, leading them all the way back to their parents' house. They knocked at the door, and when the woman opened it, saw Hansel and Gretel, she pretended that she had been expecting to see them. "You naughty children," she scolded. "Why did you sleep so long in the forest? We began to think you were never coming home." But their father was very glad to see them and hugged them close, for he had bitterly regretted leaving them behind. Not long afterwards, there was another great famine in the country, and once again there was no more food in the woodcutter's house. That night the hungry children heard their stepmother say, "It's no good. The children will have to go. There's not enough food left to feed all of us." Again the father argued and pleaded with her, and again she insisted on getting her way in the end. When his parents had gone to sleep, Hansel got out of bed and tried, as he had done before, to fill his pockets with pebbles. But this time his stepmother had bolted the door, and he could not get out. So he returned to Gretel and tried to comfort her. "Don't worry," he assured her. "Sleep well now, for God will take care of us later." Next morning the woman woke the children at dawn, gave them each a crust of bread for lunch, and told them that they were going to collect wood in the forest again. On the way there, Hansel kept looking back at the house, and his father asked him why he was so slow. "I'm looking at my little pigeon sitting on the roof," he answered. "That isn't your pigeon, idiot. That's the sun shining on the chimney," said the woman. But in reality, Hansel was crumpling up the bread in his pocket and dropping it on the ground to mark the trail. This time, they went even deeper into the forest than before. Again, the parents lit a big fire and told the children to sit by it and wait while they went to cut wood. "In the evening we shall come back and fetch you," the stepmother told Hansel and Gretel. At midday, Gretel shared her bread with Hansel, for he had strewn all of his along the trail. Then they fell asleep, and the sun set, while they were still sleeping. When they awoke, it was quite dark. Gretel began to cry, and Hansel comforted her by saying, "The moon will come up soon, Gretel, and then we shall see the breadcrumbs I scattered on the path. They will show us the way back to the house like the pebbles did before." But when the moon had risen, there were no breadcrumbs to be seen, because the birds and insects in the forest had eaten them all up. "Never mind," Hansel said bravely to Gretel. "We shall just have to find our own way out." By the third morning, they realized that they were completely lost. They seemed to be wandering in circles that led deeper and deeper into the forest. Feeling tired and hungry and frightened, they sat down on a log and wondered what to do next. Suddenly, they realized that a beautiful little snow-white bird was sitting on a branch above their heads, singing most sweetly. It seemed to be singing to them, encouraging them not to despair. Then it fluttered a little way off and seemed to be waiting for them. They rose and kept following it through the trees until they came to a little house in a clearing. It was no ordinary house, for its walls were built of honey bread and nuts. Its roof was tiled with sugar cakes, and its windows were made of peppermint sticks. "Now we can eat all we want," shouted Hansel, and he and Gretel began pulling off pieces of roof and walls and stuffing them into their mouths. Then a voice called from inside. "Nibble, nibble, little mouse, whose is nibbling on my house?" The wind, the heaven-born wind," the children called back gaily with their mouths crammed full. They had eaten a big chunk of the roof, and they were pulling out the window panes so that they could lick them more easily when suddenly the door of the house opened, and an old woman came hobbling out, leaning heavily on a crutch. The children shrank back in terror, but instead of scolding them, she smiled at them and said sweetly, "My dears, however did you find your way here? Come inside. I will give you better food than this. Don't be afraid. No harm will come to you." She took the children's hands and led them into the kitchen, where a wonderful meal had already been prepared. On the table stood steaming hot pancakes with syrup and apples and nuts. When they had eaten their fill, the old woman led them to a room with 2 cozy little white beds in it. Hansel and Gretel fell asleep that night, thinking they must have surely reached heaven. But the old woman was only pretending to be friendly. In reality, she was an evil witch, whose favorite food was little children. She had built the house of sugar and spice to entice children to visit her, and once they were in her power, she killed them, cooked them, and ate them. The witch had red eyes and could hardly see at all, but she could smell as well as a dog or a wolf. When she had smelled Hansel and Gretel a long way off, she had laughed to herself at the prospect of such a tasty dish. At daybreak the next day, she went to the room where the children were sleeping peacefully, snatched up Hansel and carried him, kicking and struggling, to the yard outside. She locked him in a cage. Then she took Gretel awake. "Get up, you lazy girl," she shouted. "Fetch some water from the well in the yard to cook your brother something good. I am going to fatten him up, and when he is fat enough, I shall eat him." Gretel was terrified, but she had to do as she was told. Every day she cleaned the house and helped the witch cook huge meals for Hansel, while she herself was only allowed to eat the scrapings from the bottom of the pot. Every morning, the old witch hobbled out to the yard and cried out shrilly, "Hansel, stick out your little finger through the bars so that I can feel how very nice and fat you're getting." But Hansel always slipped a chicken bone through the bars instead, and the witch, who could hardly see it all, pinched it and couldn't understand why Hansel never grew any fatter. When a month had gone by and Hansel was still as thin as ever despite all the food she had given him, the old witch could wait no longer. "Go to the well," she ordered Gretel, "and fetch me a bucket of water. Whether Hansel is fat or thin, I am going to boil him in a pot and eat him for my lunch tomorrow." Poor Gretel wept and begged the witch not to do it. If only the wild beasts in the forest had eaten us, then at least we could have died together. Dear God, help us, she cried. "Hold your tongue," shouted the witch. "Crying won't help you." Early the next morning, Gretel had to go out and gather wood for the fire and set the big pot of water on the stove to boil. She began to cry again when she thought what the water was to be used for. "First, we'll bake the bread," said the witch. "I have kneaded the dough and put it on the shelf to rise. Open the oven door and tell me if it's hot enough for me to put the bread in to bake." And she pushed Gretel towards the oven, intending to push her into it and bake her so that she could eat her as well as Hansel. But Gretel had guessed her plan. "I don't know how to tell if the oven is hot enough. Will you show me, please?" she asked. "You silly goose! This is how you do it," said the witch impatiently, and she opened the oven door wide and bent over to feel the heat. Gretel gave her a push and toppled her right into the oven. Then she slammed the door shut and bolted it. The witch yelled and screamed, but she could not get out, and was soon roasted to cinders. Gretel ran out to the yard and opened Hansel's cage, crying out, "Hansel, we're free! The old witch is dead!" Hansel jumped out into the yard, and they hugged one another and danced about, crying for joy. Then they went into the witch's house, where they found sacks and chests full of pearls and gold and precious stones. "These are much better than pebbles," said Hansel, stuffing the pockets in his jerkin and his knickerbockers with them. "I'll take some too," said Gretel, and she filled her apron full. "Now let's get away from here as fast as we can." When they had wandered a while, they came to a river too broad for them to swim across. While they were wondering what to do, a white duck came swimming by, and Gretel asked it to carry them to the other bank, which it kindly did, taking first Gretel and then Hansel. On the far side of the river, the forest was less thick, and the children soon began to see trees and streams that they recognized. At last they caught sight of their father's house in the distance, and although they were very tired by now, they started to run. They ran all the way home and straight into their father's arms. The poor man had regretted his act 1,000 times over, and had grown thin and gray worrying about them. Their evil stepmother, fortunately, had died. "Look, father, what we've brought home," cried the children, and they heaped the witch's treasure onto the table so that pearls and precious stones spilled in all directions. From that day onward, all their troubles were over, and they lived happily together for many years. The end. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Fairy Tale Nails. If you have any design ideas for upcoming fairy tales, please comment below. And if you like this episode and would like to see more, please consider subscribing. That way you'll be notified when the next episode is complete. And the next episode is Alibaba and the 40 Thieves. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and nail design. I feel like I'm slowly catching on to how to create videos, and the timing and the music and the story all syncing up like they're supposed to, and each video is getting just a little bit better. So thank you so much for sticking with me during the Ugly Duckling stage. I can't wait to see what new nail designs we come up with for the next story. We'll see you there. Thanks, guys.